Bumpy Johnson gave Frank Lucas 1 MERS to kill someone. Frank refused and became the richest gangster. March 15, 1967, 2:47 a.m. The phone rang in Frank Lucas's apartment. Frank grabbed it on the second ring. He already knew who it was. Only one person called at this hour. Bumpy Johnson's voice was weak, tired. The cancer was eating him alive. "Come to my place now. I have a job for you." Frank didn't ask questions. He never asked questions when Bumpy called. He got dressed in 3 minutes. Dark suit, white shirt, no tie, the uniform of a man who might need to move fast. He grabbed his keys and walked out into the cold Bronx night. The drive to Harlem took 20 minutes. The streets were empty. Even the hustlers had gone home. But Bumpy Johnson never slept anymore. The pain kept him awake. The cancer in his lungs made every breath feel like swallowing broken glass. Frank had watched Bumpy deteriorate over the past year. The most powerful man in Harlem, the man who had ruled these streets for 4 decades, was dying, and everyone knew it. When Frank arrived at Bumpy's townhouse on Lenox Avenue, the door was already unlocked. That was unusual. Bumpy was paranoid about security. Had been ever since the attempt on his life in 1952. Frank walked through the dark hallway, past the photographs on the wall showing Bumpy with politicians, celebrities, athletes, past the living room where Bumpy had hosted parties that made the newspapers, past the kitchen where Bumpy's wife might use to cook Sunday dinners for the whole crew. The house was silent now, empty. Ma moved out 6 months ago, couldn't stand watching her husband die. Frank climbed the stairs to Bumpy's bedroom. Each step felt heavier than the last. He knew this conversation was going to change everything. He just didn't know how. When Frank pushed open the bedroom door, he found the king of Harlem sitting in a wheelchair, oxygen tubes in his nose, a blanket over his legs. His hands, the same hands that had strangled. But his eyes were still sharp, still dangerous, still the eyes of a man who had survived 40 years in a business that killed most men in 5. Bumpy didn't say hello, didn't ask how Frank was doing. He just pointed to a briefcase on the nightstand. "Open it." Frank walked over and picked up the briefcase. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been. He unlatched the clasps and lifted the lid. Inside was more cash than Frank had ever seen in his life. Stacks of $100 bills wrapped in rubber bands packed tight. Row after row of money. Frank's hands started shaking. He tried to count the stacks, but lost track after 50. "How much is this?" $1 million. Frank's heart stopped. $1 million. In 1967, that was worth more than $10 million today. This was enough money to buy a city block in Manhattan. Enough to disappear to any country in the world and live like a king forever. Enough to become anybody you wanted to be. Frank had grown up with nothing. Dirt poor in LaRange, North Carolina. His family sharecroppers who never owned a thing. He'd come to New York with less than $20 in his pocket, and now he was staring at $1 million in cash. "What do you want me to do?" Bumpy leaned forward in his wheelchair. The movement made him wheeze in pain, but he pushed through it. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I want you to kill Nicky Barnes. If you're already hooked by this story, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next changed the history of organized crime forever." The target, Tango Black. And I promise you, nobody tells this story the way I'm about to tell it. Frank sat down in the chair across from Bumpy. His mind was racing. Nicky Barnes. Nicky Barnes was Bumpy's protégé, his student, the man Bumpy had been grooming to take over Harlem for the past decade. Bumpy had taught Nicky everything. How to run numbers, how to manage people, how to deal with the Italians, how to survive in a world where everyone was trying to kill you or rob you or bot. And now Bumpy wanted him dead. Why? Frank asked. The question hung in the air. Bumpy's face twisted with rage. Not the hot rage of a young man. The cold rage of someone who had been betrayed by someone they loved. Because that snake has been stealing from me for 3 years, skimming money from my operations, taking 10% off the top of every deal and hiding it in accounts I didn't know about, building his own network behind my back, recruiting my people, making promises he couldn't keep. And last week, Bumpy paused, took a labored breath. The oxygen machine hummed louder. Last week, I found out he's been talking to the Italians, making deals, promising them he'll cut them back into Harlem once I'm gone. He's going to sell everything I built to the same people I spent 40 years fighting. He's going to make us all slaves again. Frank sat there in silence. He knew Nicky Barnes. They'd worked together for years. Not closely, but enough. Nicky was smart, charming, the kind of guy who could talk his way into any room and talk his way out of any problem. Women loved him. Men respected him or feared him, sometimes both. But Frank had always sensed something off about Nicky. Something hungry in a way that couldn't be satisfied. Something that would eat and never be full. A hole where loyalty should be. "You're the only one I trust," Bumpy said. "The only one who can get close enough to do it clean. Take the money, kill Nicky, and when I die, which will be soon, everything I built goes to you." Frank looked at the briefcase. $1 million. An empire waiting for him. All he had to do was pull a trigger. But something didn't feel right. Frank had killed before plenty of times. For Bumpy, for survival, for respect in this world, sometimes you had to kill or be killed. There was no third option. But this was different. This was cold-blooded execution of a man he'd known for years. A man who'd never done anything to Frank personally. A man who, for all his flaws, had been a brother in arms. And Frank Lucas wasn't a hitman. He was a businessman. He killed when he had to, not when someone paid him to. That was a line he'd never crossed. A line he wasn't sure he could cross. No, the word came out before Frank even realized he was saying it. It hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun. Bumpy's eyes went wide. Nobody said no to Bumpy Johnson. Nobody. Not the Italian bosses who controlled half of New York. Not the politicians who owed their careers to his money. Not the cops who took his bribes and looked the other way. And certainly not a driver from North Carolina who'd only been in the game for 5 years. "What did you just say?" "I said no." Frank pushed the briefcase back toward Bumpy. The stacks of money shifted inside, rustling like leaves. "I'm not killing Nicky Barnes. Not for $1 million. Not for 10 million. That's not who I am." Frank's refusal. "I'm not killing Tango." The room went silent. Frank could hear Bumpy's labored breathing, the oxygen machine humming, his own heart pounding in his chest so loud he was sure Bumpy could hear it. Dude, he just told the most powerful man in Harlem to go to hell. His life was probably over. Bumpy would have him killed before sunrise, left in an alley somewhere. Another body nobody would ask questions about. Then Bumpy did something Frank never expected. He smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not the smile of a man about to order an execution. A genuine smile. The smile of a man who had just found what he was looking for. "Good." Bumpy leaned back in his wheelchair. The tension in the room evaporated like morning fog. "That's exactly what I wanted, T." Frank was confused. His mind couldn't process what was happening. "What?" "I've been testing everyone, Frank. Everyone who works for me. Everyone who wants to take over when I'm gone. I've had this same conversation in this same room with this same briefcase 12 times in the past 2 months. I offered them the same deal, the same $1 million, the same target. You know what they all said?" Frank shook his head. "They all said yes. Every single one of them. Ready to kill Nicky Barnes for the money without asking a single question. Without thinking twice. Without wondering if it was a trap. Without caring whether Nicky actually deserved to die. Just saw the money and started counting." Bumpy pointed at Frank. His finger was bony, trembling, but his aim was steady. "But you said no. You pushed the money away. You told the most powerful man in Harlem that you weren't going to do what he asked. That takes something, Frank. That takes principles. And principles are the only thing that separates a king from a common criminal. Smash that like button if you're realizing right now that Bumpy Johnson was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Because what he tells Frank next changes everything." Bumpy reached under his blanket and pulled out a folder. Thick, heavy, stuffed with papers and photographs and documents that looked older than Frank. "This is everything, Frank. Every business I own, every property, every bank account, every offshore account, every safe deposit box, every connection I've made in 40 years, every favor that's owed to me, every secret I've kept. This is 40 years of building an empire, and I'm giving it all to you." Frank stared at the folder like it might explode. "Why me? You barely know me. I've only been working for you for 5 years. I've been your driver, your errand boy. I'm nobody. That's exactly why, Bumpy said. Everyone else has been around too long. They're corrupted, comfortable, lazy. They think they're entitled to what I bill. Bumpy's ultimatum: kill him or walk. Entitlement doesn't build empires, Frank. Hunger does. And you're the hungriest person I've ever met. Frank couldn't argue with that. He was hungry. Had been hungry his whole life. Hungry to escape poverty. Hungry to be somebody. Hungry to prove that a black man from the South could build something that mattered. That hunger was the only thing that had kept him alive. Bumpy opened a folder and started explaining the numbers racket that brought in $50,000 a week. Runners in every neighborhood. Collectors who made rounds like clockwork. Protection from the cops who were paid to look the other way. The nightclubs that served as fronts for other operations. Small's Paradise on 135th Street. The Cotton Club legacy. Places where you could launder money, make connections, and keep your finger on the pulse of Harlem all at once. The relationships with corrupt cops who didn't just look the other way, but actively helped. Detective Marcus Williams, who tipped Bumpy off before raids. Sergeant Patterson, who made evidence disappear. Captain O'Brien, who controlled the whole precinct. The connections to politicians who owed their careers to Bumpy's money and muscle. A state senator, 2 city councilmen, a judge who had never ruled against anyone Bumpy sent his way. The supply chains, the distribution networks, the enforcers who kept everyone in line, the lawyers who kept everyone out of jail, everything. It was overwhelming. Frank had known Bumpy was powerful, but he'd never understood the scale. This wasn't just a criminal enterprise. This was a shadow government, an alternative system of power that existed alongside the official one, but answered to different rules. But here's the most important thing, Bumpy said. He pulled out a piece of paper with a name and address written on it in careful handwriting. This is a man named Ike Atkinson. He's a sergeant in the U.S. Army stationed in Bangkok, Thailand. Right now, he's smuggling small amounts of heroin back to the States through military channels. Nobody checks military cargo. Nobody searches Army planes. Nobody questions soldiers coming home from Vietnam. It's the perfect pipeline. Frank studied the paper. The name meant nothing to him, but the possibilities were already forming in his mind. You want me to work with him? I want you to think bigger than him. Ike is bringing in kilos. I want you to bring in tons. The Italians control the heroin trade because they control the French connection. The supply from Marseilles through the Corsican gangs into New York. They've had a monopoly for 20 years, but that supply is weak. Cut to hell by the time it reaches the streets. 5% purity, maybe 6 if you're lucky. The real product is in Southeast Asia. The Golden Triangle, pure, uncut, 98%. The kind of heroin that makes the Italian product look like baby powder. If you can get that product directly from the source and bring it to Harlem without going through the Italians, you'll control the entire market. You'll be richer than I ever was, richer than the Mafia ever dreamed of being, richer than anyone. Frank's mind was spinning. This wasn't just an inheritance. This was a blueprint for an empire, a roadmap to becoming the most powerful drug dealer in American history. But it was also a death sentence if he got caught. The Italians would kill him. The DEA would hunt him. The other dealers would try to take what he built. He'd be making enemies everywhere he turned. Frank walks out with nothing. There's one more thing, Bumpy said. His voice got quiet. Serious. The kind of serious that meant life and death. Nicky Barnes is going to come after you. The moment I die, he's going to try to take everything. He's already made deals with the Italians. Already promised them he'll bring Harlem back under their control. Give them their cut again. Let them run things the way they did before I took over. And the Italians are going to back him because they'd rather have a puppet they can control than a king. They can't. So what do? You let him think he's winning. Let him make his moves. Let him get comfortable. Let him build his little alliances and make his little plans. And when he's confident that he's about to take over Harlem, when he thinks he's already won, you show him what real power looks like. Bumpy handed Frank a key. Small, brass, old. The kind of key that opens something important. Safe deposit box at Harlem Savings Bank. Box 1147. Inside, you'll find $2 million in cash and documents that prove Nicky Barnes has been informing for the FBI since 1965. Frank nearly dropped the key. The metal suddenly felt hot in his hand. Nicky's a rat. Has been for years. The feds have been protecting him. That's why he's never been arrested while everyone around him goes to prison. That's why he's always one step ahead of every bust. That's why he walks around Harlem like he's untouchable, because he is untouchable as long as he's useful to the FBI. Nothing can touch him. Frank thought about all the times Nicky had seemed to know things he shouldn't know. All the close calls that everyone else took, but Nicky somehow avoided. All the dealers who got arrested right after meeting with Nicky. It all made sense now. But if that information gets out, Bumpy continued, the Italians will kill him themselves. They hate rats more than they hate us, more than they hate anyone. A rat is worse than a murderer in their eyes. If they find out Nicky's been talking to the feds, they'll put a contract on him so big that every hitman in New York will be looking for him. Bumpy grabbed Frank's hand. His grip was weak, the grip of a dying man, but his eyes were fierce, burning with the last fire he had left. Promise me something, Frank. Promise me you'll build something bigger than I ever could. Promise me you'll make them remember that Harlem belongs to Harlem. Not the Italians, not the feds, not the politicians who treat us like votes and then forget we exist. Us, our people. Promise me. Frank looked at the folder full of secrets, the key to the safe deposit box, the briefcase still sitting on the nightstand with $1 million inside. He thought about his mother back in North Carolina, still living in poverty, his brothers and sisters who never got out. Everyone who'd ever told him he'd never be anything. I promise. Hit that subscribe button right now if you want to see how Frank Lucas kept that promise. Because what he did next made him the most legendary gangster in American history. July 7th, 1968. Bumpy Johnson died at Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street and 7th Avenue. He was eating fried chicken, his favorite meal, the same meal he'd been eating at that restaurant for 30 years. Halfway through, he grabbed his chest. His face went gray. He tried to say something, but no words came out. Then he fell forward into his plate and never moved again. Heart attack. The cancer had weakened him so much that his heart just gave up. Dead before anyone could even call an ambulance. Dead before he could finish his last meal. Frank got the call 15 minutes later. He was at his apartment in the Bronx going over the papers Bumpy had given him, learning the business, memorizing the names and numbers, preparing for what came next. When the phone rang, he knew. He knew before he even picked it up. Bumpy's gone. 3 words. That's all it took. Frank hung up the phone. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't punch a wall or pour himself a drink. He got dressed, put on his best suit, black, respectful, the suit of a man going to claim what was his. And he drove to Harlem. The streets were already buzzing when he arrived. Word travels fast in Harlem. By the time Frank crossed the bridge, there were people gathered outside Wells' restaurant. Some crying, some just standing there staring, unable to believe that Bumpy Johnson was really dead. The king was gone, and everyone was wondering what came next. Who would take over? Who would control the numbers? Who would protect them from the Italians? Who would keep the peace? Frank knew exactly what came next. He drove straight to Harlem Savings Bank, walked in like he owned the place, went to the safe deposit boxes in the back, box 1147. He used the key Bumpy had given him. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. Inside the box was exactly what Bumpy had promised. $2 million in cash, stacked neat, wrapped tight, more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, and a folder thick with documents. Frank opened it and started reading. Photographs of Nicky Barnes' meeting with FBI agents. Clear shots. Undeniable. Transcripts of conversations where Nicky gave up names, addresses, operations. Payment records showing the FBI had been giving Nicky money for years. Enough evidence to destroy him 10 times over. Frank took everything. The cash, the documents, put it all in a duffel bag and walked out of the bank. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked questions. He was just a man in a suit carrying a bag. Nobody knew he was carrying the future Harlem. The funeral was 3 days later. Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street, the biggest, most famous black church in Harlem. The kind of church where history happened. 2,000 people showed up. Politicians in expensive suits. Gangsters in even more expensive suits. Celebrities who owed Bumpy favors. Musicians who'd gotten their start in his clubs. Everyone who was anyone in Black America came to pay respects to Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem for 40 years. Frank arrived late on purpose. He wanted everyone to see him walk in. He wanted them to wonder why he was late. He wanted them to notice. He was carrying a briefcase. Not the same briefcase Bumpy had shown him, but an identical one. This one was filled with Frank's own money. $100,000 in cash. Every dollar he'd saved in 5 years. Frank walked straight down the center aisle. 2,000 people watching him, past the pews filled with mourners, past Nicky Barnes, who was sitting in the second row with that smug look on his face, like he already knew he was going to take over. Like the crown was already on his head. Past the Italian representatives who'd come to see how the power would shift. Past the politicians who were already calculating who they needed to make friends with next. Frank walked all the way to the front to the casket. Open casket. Bumpy looked peaceful. His face relaxed. No more pain. No more cancer eating him from the inside. He was finally free. Frank stood there for a moment, said a silent prayer. Then he opened the briefcase. The church went silent. 2,000 people holding their breath. Nobody knew what Frank Lucas was about to do. Frank pulled out the first stack of $100 bills. $10,000. He placed it in the casket next to Bumpy's hand. Then another stack. 20,000. Then another. 30,000. 50,000. 75,000. $100,000 placed around Bumpy's body like treasure being buried with an ancient king. The kind of tribute you give to someone who changed your life. Someone who saw something in you that nobody else saw. Someone who gave you a chance when nobody else would. The church was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. This was something they'd never seen before. Something that would become legend. Then Frank turned around and faced the congregation. 2,000 faces staring at him. Some confused, some impressed, some angry. Frank's eyes found Nicky Barnes. Nicky's smug expression was gone, replaced by something else. Fear, uncertainty. The look of a man who just realized the game was changing. Some of you think you're going to take what Bumpy built, Frank said, his voice carried through the church without a microphone. Clear, strong, the voice of a man who wasn't asking permission. Some of you think you're going to divide up his empire like a Thanksgiving turkey. A piece for you, a piece for you. Everybody gets a taste. Some of you have already made deals with people outside this community. Promise them you'll bring Harlem back under their control. Sell out your own people for a seat at somebody else's table. Frank's eye stayed on Nicky. Everyone in the church turned to see who Frank was looking at. You're all wrong. Bumpy Johnson didn't leave his empire to a committee. He didn't leave it to be divided up. He left it to me. All of it. And I'm telling you right now in front of God and everyone in this church that Harlem belongs to Harlem. Anyone who has a problem with that can come see me directly. Nobody said a word. Nobody challenged him. The Italians watched him with new eyes. Nicky Barnes looked like he wanted to disappear. And Frank Lucas walked out of that church a different man than he walked in. He walked in as Bumpy's driver. He walked out as the new king of Harlem. Drop a comment right now telling me if you think Frank can hold on to that crown, because Nicky Barnes and the Italian Mafia are about to come for everything he has. And what happens next will blow your mind. 3 weeks after the funeral, Nicky Barnes made his move. He'd been planning this for years, waiting, watching, building alliances while pretending to be loyal. And now that Bumpy was dead, there was nothing holding him back. Nicky called a meeting with the heads of the 5 Italian crime families. The meeting was at a restaurant in Little Italy, Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street, neutral territory. Nicky walked in wearing a custom suit that cost more than most people made in a month. Gold watch, diamond rings. The look of a man who thought he was already in charge. Sitting at the table with the most powerful criminals in New York. Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo, Carmine Trey. Men who had ordered hundreds of murders. Men who controlled billions of dollars, men. Drop a comment right now telling me if you think Frank can hold on to that crown, because Nicky Barnes and the Italian Mafia are about to come for everything he has. And what happens next will blow your mind. 3 weeks after the funeral, Nicky Barnes made his move. He'd been planning this for years, waiting, watching, building alliances while pretending to be loyal. And now that Bumpy was dead, there was nothing holding him back. Nicky called a meeting with the heads of the 5 Italian crime families. The meeting was at a restaurant in Little Italy, Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street, neutral territory. Nicky walked in wearing a custom suit that cost more than most people made in a month. Gold watch, diamond rings, the look of a man who thought he was already in charge. Sitting at the table were the most powerful criminals in New York. Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo, Carmine Trey, men who had ordered hundreds of murders, men who controlled billions of dollars, men who thought they controlled Harlem, too. Frank Lucas is a problem, Nicky told them. He spoke with confidence. The confidence of a man who had been practicing this speech for years. He's got no connections outside Harlem. No organization that extends beyond the neighborhood. No experience running an operation this big. He's a driver, an errand boy. Bumpy made a mistake trusting him. The Italians listened. They didn't interrupt. That's how you knew they were interested. Give me 6 months, Nicky continued. 6 months, and I'll have Harlem back under control. Your control. We go back to the old arrangement. 50-50, it's split on everything. You supply the product, I distribute it. Everyone makes money the way it should have been all along. Carlo Gambino leaned forward. He was an old man, quiet, never raised his voice. But when he spoke, people listened because the quiet ones were always the most dangerous. And Frank Lucas? I'll handle Frank. Lucas, he'll be out of the way before you know he was even there. Gambino looked at the other bosses. A silent conversation passed between them. The kind of conversation that decided who lived and who died. We'll give you the support you need, Gambino said finally. Soldiers, money, protection from the police we control, but we want proof that you can deliver. Take care of Frank Lucas. Make it clean. Make it quiet. Then we'll talk about the future. Nicky smiled. The smile of a man who thought he'd already won. Consider it done. But Nicky made a mistake. The same mistake men had been making about Frank Lucas his whole life. He underestimated him. While Nicky was in Little Italy making deals with the Italians, Frank Lucas was on a plane to Bangkok. He'd taken Bumpy's advice, contacted Ike Atkinson, used the connections Bumpy had given him to arrange a meeting, and now he was flying halfway around the world to see the operation for himself. The flight took 36 hours, 3 layovers. Frank had never been outside the United States before, never had a passport, never seen a world that wasn't New York or North Carolina. But he wasn't nervous. He was focused, hungry, ready. When Frank landed in Bangkok, Ike Atkinson was waiting for him. Ike was Army through and through, built like a tank, the kind of man you wanted on your side in a fight. He'd been running small-scale, smuggling operations for years. Heroin hidden in furniture, in coffins, in the personal effects of soldiers coming home from Vietnam. Small stuff, a few kilos here and there. Enough to make money, but not enough to attract attention. Ike took Frank to meet his suppliers. They drove for hours into the jungle, past villages where people had never seen a television, past poppy fields that stretched to the horizon, until they reached a processing facility hidden in the mountains. And what Frank saw there changed everything. The heroin was pure, 98% pure. Frank had the product tested right there. Watched the chemist run the analysis. The Italian product that came through the... Frank came back to New York with a plan. A plan that would make him the richest drug dealer in American history. He called his product Blue Magic, the purest heroin ever sold on the streets of New York. 98% pure. Cut in half, and it was still 4 times stronger than anything the Italians had. Sold at half the price. The fiends went crazy. Word spread through Harlem like wildfire. Blue Magic, the best product anyone had ever seen. People were traveling from Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, New Jersey, just to get their hands on Frank's heroin. The lines outside his spot stretched around the block. Within 6 months, Blue Magic controlled 70% of the heroin trade in New York. The Italians' business collapsed. Their customers disappeared. Their dealers couldn't compete. Nobody wanted the weak, overpriced garbage they were selling when they could get Blue Magic. Subscribe right now because what happens next between Frank and Nicky is going to blow your mind. And I promise you, nobody tells this story the way I'm about to tell it. Nicky Barnes was left with nothing. The Italians blamed him for failing to stop Frank. His promises of taking back Harlem were worthless. Now Frank Lucas had done what nobody thought was possible. He'd cut the Italian Mafia out of the heroin trade entirely. His own people started switching sides. The soldiers Nicky had recruited saw which way the wind was blowing. They wanted to work for the winner, and the winner was Frank Lucas. The empire Nicky thought was his for the taking crumbled before it ever existed. He was a general without an army, a king without a kingdom, a rat without a hole to hide in. December 1971, 3 years after Bumpy's funeral. Frank Lucas was making $1 million a day, not a week, not a month, a day. He owned properties across New York and New Jersey, 100 houses, commercial buildings, nightclubs. He had a mansion in Teaneck that looked like it belonged to a movie star. He had corrupted cops, judges, and politicians on his payroll. Not just beat cops taking $50 to look the other way. Detectives, captains, prosecutors, people who could make evidence disappear, people who could tip him off before raids, people who could make sure his people never stayed in jail for long. He had a fleet of luxury cars, Rolls-Royces, Cadillacs, Mercedes. He had women. He had respect. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He had kept his promise to Bumpy Johnson. He had built something bigger than Bumpy ever dreamed. Harlem belonged to Harlem, and Frank Lucas was its king. But Frank made a mistake. The same mistake that destroys every king eventually. He got comfortable, confident, visible. When you're on top, you start believing you'll always be on top. March 8th, 1971. The Muhammad Ali Joe Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century. 15 rounds between the two best heavyweight boxers who ever lived. Every celebrity, every gangster, every power player in America was there. The tickets cost a fortune. The ringside seats cost a bigger fortune. And Frank Lucas showed up wearing a chinchilla coat and hat that cost $50,000. He walked through Madison Square Garden like he owned it, which in a way he did. He had more money than most of the people there, more power than the politicians sitting in the cheap seats. He sat ringside, better seats than the mafia bosses, better seats than the corporate executives, right there where everyone could see him. A detective named Richie Roberts was working security that night. Roberts was one of the few honest cops left in New York. Couldn't be bribed, couldn't be bought. The kind of cop other cops hated because he made them look bad. Roberts saw Frank, saw the coat, saw the seats, saw the way people treated him, and asked himself a question that would change everything. Who is that guy? And how does he have better seats than Carlo Gambino? Roberts started asking around. Nobody knew Frank Lucas. At least nobody in the law enforcement world. He didn't have a record, didn't have a file, didn't exist as far as the police were concerned. A black man in a $50,000 coat sitting ringside at the biggest fight of the century. And nobody knew who he was. That was wrong. That meant Frank Lucas was someone who should be known. Roberts started investigating. It took 4 years. 4 years of tracking shipments, turning informants, following money, connecting dots that didn't seem to connect, building a case piece by piece. Frank Lucas was careful, smarter than most. But nobody's perfect, and Roberts was relentless. January 28th, 1975. 6th Alboy M. Richie Roberts and the DEA kicked down Frank Lucas's door, the house in Teaneck, the mansion with a swimming pool and the garage full of luxury cars. They found $584,000 in cash hidden in walls, hidden in furniture, hidden in places most people would never think to look. They found heroin. They found ledgers. They found evidence of the entire operation. Frank Lucas was arrested facing life in prison. 70 years. He was never going to see the outside of a cell again. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what Frank does next is the most gangster thing in this entire story. Frank Lucas wasn't going down alone. He remembered what Bumpy had told him about Nicky Barnes, about the documents proving Nicky was an FBI informant. Frank had been holding on to that information for 7 years, waiting for the right moment, keeping it like a loaded gun in a safe. This was the moment. Frank made a deal with the prosecutors. He would cooperate. He would give them everything. Names, addresses, operations, routes, corrupt cops, dirty politicians, judges who took bribes, prosecutors who made cases disappear. everyone who had helped him build his empire. In exchange, his sentence would be reduced. He'd